Welcome back. In this video, we will conclude with talking about the three different parts of the essay by focusing on the conclusion. Previously, we discussed that an essay has three fundamental parts, the first of which is known as the introduction, the second of which is known as the body, and the last of which is, of course, known as the conclusion. Briefly, the introduction serves to introduce the topic of an essay and engage the reader's attention. You can think of the introduction as the first impression that an essay must make on the reader. If the essay fails to engage the reader in the introduction, the reader is unlikely to continue reading the essay. The body then explains, illustrates, and/or develops the topic introduced in the introduction. So if the reader comes to the essay for the introduction, the reader typically stays for the sake of the body. So the body has the heavy lifting to do of not only explaining and/or developing the topic introduced in the introduction, but it also must create a coherent, cohesive, and comprehensible, not necessarily narrative, but certainly a track of thought for the reader to follow. Finally, the conclusion is interesting in that the conclusion has the unenviable job of needing to wrap everything up for the reader. So the conclusion must reinforce the major thrust or idea of the essay. In particular, the conclusion is also responsible for revealing the insight or takeaway of the essay itself. Okay, let me just adjust this quickly so you can see that. All right. So the introduction introduces the topic, the body develops the topic, and the conclusion must provide the takeaway or insight about the topic. In other words, what is important about the topic? What should the reader learn as a result of reading this essay? It's critical that any essay, really anything written at all, has a point or purpose behind it. That seems obvious that if one is writing anything, there should be a communicative point. But usually what happens, especially in a long form piece of writing like an essay, is that the major point, the major takeaway, the main idea is lost in translation, so to speak. Many writers tend to go off topic. They tend to introduce an abundance of subtopics, and somewhere along the way, the main message of the essay is lost. And so the conclusion is the final opportunity for the reader to circle back to that original idea and make sure that the reader understands what the essay was really trying to convey. You can think about a presentation as being something similar to this. In the beginning of a presentation, the presenter will outline his or her major goals for the presentation. In the body, the presenter will provide the meat or major substance of the information. And finally, in the conclusion, the presenter must summarize and conclude and wrap everything up, providing the audience typically with key takeaways. The conclusion of an essay must function in a similar way. It is the last opportunity for the writer to emphasize the key takeaways that the reader should absorb or learn by the end of the essay. So if we can think of the essay as being 100% full of information, the conclusion is that opportunity to highlight the important 10 to 20% that the reader must, regardless of anything else, take away to have sufficiently learned something from the essay. Now, in an academic sense, or rather setting, conclusions tend to be divided into two basic parts. The first of which is the restatement of the thesis statement. The second of which is the so what question. So these 2 points essentially reflect the functions that I mentioned previously. The conclusion must restate the major idea or thrust of the essay. Now, this doesn't mean that that thesis statement or major idea should be repeated verbatim if it appeared previously in the essay. It simply means that the conclusion must bring to mind once again what the major point of the essay was about. And lastly, this so what question is telling the reader what is important about the essay. Now, a conclusion does not have to be particularly patronizing or condescending when answering the so what question. There doesn't need to be an explicit line that necessarily tells the reader what to think. However, it is important that the conclusion, at the very least, provides some kind of direction or guidance as to what the reader should be thinking about. The conclusion shouldn't introduce new information necessarily, but the conclusion should give the reader some directions for which to think about how the content of the essay that was read can be applied to his or her daily life. For example, if I'm reading an essay about climate change or environmentalism, there should be something at the end of the essay that makes me reflect on the applicability of that information. What can I do with the information? How does it help me? In what ways should I change my behavior? What do I know? How should I think about this issue moving forward? All of those are valid questions that a conclusion should tackle. So the conclusion is really about ensuring that the reader takes something away from the experience. Now, that seems perhaps less important than the body or even the introduction, but the conclusion's function is very vital to the success of any essay. An effective introduction and an effective body are not necessarily going to have much impact or weight if the conclusion does not make it clear to the reader why all of this is important to begin with. You can think of the conclusion as being similar to the adage, you're only as good as the last feat or accomplishment you made. So you can be doing very well in the beginning and in the middle of your professional career, for example, but if at the end you ultimately stumble and fail, you're going to be remembered for the failure more so than your earlier successes. Just like in a story, a bad ending can ruin the entirety of the narrative, even if for the first 75 to even 80, maybe even 90% of the narrative, the reader was actively engaged. If the conclusion fails to satisfy or gratify the audience, then the narrative will ultimately fail. We can think of it as the illusion of the narrative falling apart. There is an engagement that at some point is broken, and then the rest of the story's integrity suffers as a result. An essay is no different in this respect. So the conclusion is extremely important because if the reader has made it to this point, the conclusion can make or break the success of the essay overall. With that said, hopefully you now have a better idea of the parts and purpose of a conclusion. The conclusion, again, is intended to wrap up the essay as a whole and leave the reader with some kind of interesting insight or takeaway that articulates the importance of the content of the essay. All the parts of the essay, the introduction, the body, and the conclusion, work together to ensure that the reader learns something from the essay. It is very important to always keep in mind that the purpose of an essay, above anything else, is to communicate some kind of message. The introduction, body, and conclusion work together to ensure that the reader comprehends the message. If any part of the conclusion, of the essay is lacking, if the introduction is not clear, if the body is not developed enough, if the conclusion does not make a strong enough impact, it is possible that the entire essay will fail as a result. Before we conclude the video, I will re-illustrate what I think the structure of an essay should resemble. So you may recall in an earlier video, we talked about how an introduction acts as a kind of upside down pyramid, starting with general information and then becoming more specific as the essay, or excuse me, the introduction progresses. The body can be thought of as the juncture point between the introduction and the conclusion because it provides the most specific parts and content of the essay. And then the conclusion is a right side up triangle, essentially forming an hourglass shape with the introduction. We then move from specific content and details to more general extrapolations and takeaways based on the content of the essay overall. So the introduction begins generally, the body gets very specific with its exploration of the topic, and the conclusion then returns to that more general bird's eye view in order to provide a takeaway or insight based on the content that can be applied to daily life, or that can be used to learn new lessons that are not necessarily so wrapped up in the nuances and minutiae of the body and the specific content of the essay. So again, I hope that you have now understood and learned something about the conclusion, and that you have a better understanding of how the conclusion works together with the other parts of the essay, such as the introduction and body, to articulate a point. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next video.